We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Welcome to Multipolarity. I'm Gavin Haynes. I produce the show, but I'm also a freelance obstetrician. If this isn't the voice you're expecting to hear, that's because this week we're doing something we haven't done in almost a year, a question and answer session from the lads. Last week we put out a call for your questions and you answered in your thousands. Today we've gone through that long list and whistled it down into a short list of what we hope are questions that show the span of what multipolarity is about and the things that we thought were a bit interesting and different. Among other topics, we're covering the Chinese in Mexico, rent-seeking behaviour in the West, Airbus, the German elite, book recommendations, and memes. We'd like to thank everyone who sent in a question. We're regularly alarmed by the intelligence of our audience, but if yours hasn't made the cut, well, we had to cut somewhere. Also, often listeners sent in similar questions, so where that's happened, we've tried to group them by topic. It's not yet clear how long we're going to run to today. Almost every one of these questions is a kind of a world unto itself, most of the equivalent of a 15-minute segment on the regular show, and some could be books. So we may just end up answering questions until one or all of us falls over. Of course, this is also premium week, so to get the full whack, you'll have to be signed up on Patreon. Sign up is easy. Go to patreon.com/multipolarity. It's $5, pounds or euros a month, and you can cancel any time. I've got one more act of multipolarity housekeeping I should also mention, and that's that the Substack is about to go live. It's presently called The Crack Up, and you can subscribe to that by heading to Substack and searching for Multipolarity. Andrew Collingwood, you've been pulling together the first batch of articles for that, haven't you? It's sort of supplanting your former newsletter, Britannic.
I wouldn't say, Gavin, that it is replacing Britannic or superseding Britannic, because Britannic was very much focused on the UK. It was a weekly collection of essays and ideas and podcasts and videos that focused on British society, politics, and culture. Whereas the Multipolarity Substack is by very nature global in outlook. It also will, as we go, look at some of the changing forms of societal and political organisation within the Western world, especially given that the current system seems to be cracking up. What we're going to try and do every week is pull together a kind of multipolarity brief that looks at some of the key news stories of the week. There'll be more than is in the podcast because we have to cut that down to 3. But there'll be a brief outline and a kind of a brief multipolarity take on some of these things. But what we'll also be doing is we'll also be putting together more serious essays. They might be quite short. In some cases, they might be very long because they're big subjects. But I think at first we'll have 2 running series of essays that'll, drop as and when. One will be on global flashpoints. So we've seen recently a flashpoint on the eastern approaches of Europe. There's also been a flashpoint recently in the Caucasus. But there are these flashpoints all around the world, as far south as the very southern tip of the Atlantic Ocean, in places like the Western Sahara, in the Sahel, in Southeast Asia. So we'll be looking at some of the geopolitics and some of the huge tectonic forces that are in play in those places. And then we'll also do, I think, at first, a running theme on new logistics routes. Everybody knows about the Belt and Road Initiative that China has been funding for in recent decades. But there's more than that. And I think these are very interesting because they, in and of themselves, change geopolitics. If you start linking certain sections of the world, then they do affect the geopolitics of those regions and also globally. So I think that's something very interesting to look at. And we have several on the Eurasian landmass, in Southeast Asia, and in South America as well, just to start with. So those will be 2 on-running series, and hopefully, as and when I find time and motivation and keen interest in certain areas, other essays will drop as well. So we hope to get the first one up. I think the plan is we're going to have a kind of an opening essay that kind of pins our colours to the mast, pins our thesis to the cathedral door. And then over the next week, we'll probably have a multipolarity brief to start things off. And then shortly after that, an essay on a global flashpoint, or more probably a new global logistics and transport route. So I think these will be very interesting for people. Certainly at first, we're going to make this free of charge. It's something that people can read and enjoy. So please look up for that. I'm not sure about the final name as the crack up. It seems pretty good for now, but we can discuss that. And please look out for it. I'll certainly publicize it later this week when the first essay goes live.
Sounds damned impressive. Are you much of a Substacker as a reader?
Yeah, I am actually. I've got the Substack app, which is actually really good. You get a little in tray of Substacks that come in. I've subscribed and paid for a few, which I think are great and fascinating. And some of them, I get the free essays, which are often worth it as well. I do think Substack is good because it gives you a chance to pay people for interesting information that they're giving you. And, at $5 a pop, it's like I can just have one less beer on a weekend. And if I did that, it would be good for me anyway. So it's, I do. I love Substack, actually. I think it's been great. I think it gives, I'm doing the Substack sell here, and I don't mean to, but I do think it has given people with interesting opinions and even kind of pretty serious investigative journalism. If you look at Matt Taibbi's Substack, Byron Weiss's Substack, Seymour Hersh's Substack, there's even one that focuses on news in the Northwest, like real local news in the Northwest of England. And if the US is anything like Britain, then local news is kind of a dying industry, and it is an extremely important service. And then you have super high-end ones, super high-paid ones like Sam O'Buria's Bismarck analysis, which I can't quite afford at $120 a month. But, Substack does give a means for folks like that to earn a bit of cash. And perhaps ultimately, if ours is popular enough and well-received enough, we might be able to put something together where we roll Substack into podcast subscriptions. I don't know. But for now, it's going to be free, and I hope people enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Northwest of England local news franchise is rolling out across the country. They have a version in Birmingham now, one in Sheffield. I subscribe to them all, and I don't really need to know about Sheffield and Birmingham, but I find the whole concept fascinating in that all that stuff that went away in the 2010s is being reborn. I kind of like the sort of alternative media archipelago of Barry Weiss et al. And local news is the feeder, is the font for real journalism that you used to read in the Nationals. And, that's a problem people have been working on for ages, but the Substack world seems to be on the brink of solving it.
Very much so. And it would be great, for instance, if there was a court reporting Substack. I think that's something that I would subscribe to on a kind of public service basis. I think Substack is great. And I hope that once our Multipolarity Substack becomes regular, it can also be a constant source of explanation, of discovery, of detail, really a way of making sense of what is a quite chaotic at the moment and even quite dangerous shift in world orders from unipolar to multipolar. And I think given the performance of the mainstream press, it does take quite a lot of ferreting around and an effort to really try to get at the heart of these things. And it also takes a fair bit of kind of parsing ability and kind of an ability to comprehend, well, what does this really mean? Like, what's really happening here? So I hope that what the Multipolarity Substack will do is give people a glimpse at that. Like, we can do the ferreting, we can do the reading because we're into this stuff anyway. And we can kind of parse some of these important questions and give people a glimpse at what is actually happening in the world and some of what are not just trends, but kind of mega trends. So, I hope people very much enjoy it, and I hope it's worthwhile.
Philip Pilkington, you're occasionally seen on Gladden Pappen's excellent Substack, The Post-Liberal Order. Would he be seen on ours?
Yeah, I suppose so. Great, more writing commitments for me. I love those. But I'll certainly try and put something together. I'm a little overworked at the moment, but we'll see.
Fantastic. Well, without much further ado, let's get into the questions. And the first question is for a young man called Philip Pilkington. It's sort of a double question, actually. The master header is rent-seeking in the West, and I guess Western economic activity in general, and how we measure that. We have two questions. Both have come from Twitter. One is from Colin, who says, how much of Western economic activity is merely rents as opposed to actual productive activity? And then there's another from Rafly, which is the bulk of Western GDP growth simply service sector inflation booked in as productivity gains? So I guess, Philip Pilkington, there's something in there about the Potemkin village aspect of modern Western life that we occasionally come across in the show, and the sense of the sclerosis and slide and accounting tricks happening in the background that have led the West to perhaps overestimate its own power. I mean, that's a common multipolarity theme, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you to both the people asking questions for such simple questions. But look, this is a kind of a topic of debate in alt economic world. Has been for a while, but has really come into its own recently with the failure of the Russian sanctions, especially, and the misreading of the strength of the Russian economy. So I think the touch point here is twofold on the rents question. I'm sure the person who asked the question probably is aware of what I'm about to say, but for the benefit of other listeners, the key economist that's currently talking about this is Michael Hudson. We've talked about Michael Hudson's work on the show before. I think his book Super Imperialism, I think, is the book to read on how the US dollar system came into being and how it largely works, or at least worked until recently. And Michael Hudson's been raising this question about rent extraction effectively. Now, again, if you've heard Michael Hudson talk about this, you'll already know what I'm going to say, but for the benefit of the audience that haven't, as Hudson says, modern economic theory has actually no place for the concept of rent. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in neoclassical economic theory. It doesn't really exist in Keynesian theory, although that's a little bit more complicated. It may. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, rent doesn't exist in modern economic theory. Rent did exist in classical economic theory. That is, all economic theory going actually pre-Adam Smith. Really, you can go back to the physiocrats and so on, and going right up to, well, there's a big debate when classical economics ends, but it's probably around Karl Marx is probably the last true classical economist. And all these economists had a notion of rent. And the reason that they did was actually very simple, because the economy was divided between the productive industries and the landed gentry, the aristocrat class. Land did produce goods. I mean, it produced sustenance and material for clothes and so on. So land was actually more important, in a sense, to the 19th century British, early 19th century British economy, or 18th century British economy. It was more important. But it was very clear to those economists that the economic dynamics behind land was very different to industry. And whereas industry was concerned with maximizing profit, land was about the extraction by a class of people, ownership class, of rent. And so as we transitioned into the 20th century and the rise of neoclassical and, to an extent, Keynesian economics as well, rent got left in the background. So rent doesn't exist as a concept. The issue here, of course, is that if rent doesn't exist as a concept in modern economic theory, it doesn't get measured, and nobody tries to measure it. The issue with this is it's pretty obvious that rent exists. It's very hard to see how it doesn't, in a sense. I mean, we did a whole show on YIMBYism and housing and all that, and a big theme of that really was me pointing out that the housing market's set up as a rent extraction mechanism, much like the old landed gentry extracted rent from the land. Housing is just the most obvious instance of rent extraction, but you see this kind of at all levels now. I mean, if you pick up your smartphone right now, it's kind of a rent-seeking device in a lot of ways. The most obvious rent extraction mechanisms are payment platforms. It's kind of well known in the app-making business that what you really want to monetize your app is some capacity to extract rent from financial transactions. You know, a penny out of each transaction or whatever, because that's how you really make money, because you scale it and you make an absolute fortune. Pretty much all these apps, the ones that you're not paying for, are rent extraction mechanisms. Most of these e-businesses, in a sense, seem to be rent extraction mechanisms in a way too. So that raises obviously the question that the first person's asked. How much of the economy is made up of this stuff? I would say intuitively a growing share, that's for sure. I mean, 50 years ago, housing was not a rent extraction mechanism. Sure, there were landlords and there were tenants, but it wasn't clear that the housing market as a whole was set up in order to extract rent. In my opinion, it currently is. See the Pilkington versus YIMBY debate from a few months ago. They think it's still a normal a good. I think it's a financial asset through which rent is extracted. And I'd imagine, by the way, Michael Hudson would probably agree with my analysis on that one. But, you know, you see these things cropping up everywhere. And that speaks to the question as well, is that a good or a bad thing? Rent inherently, especially in the classical tradition of economics, but I'd say even prior to that, you can probably find it in Aristotle and so on, rent is seen as a kind of grubby activity. It's seen as less dignified in a sense, as true productive activity in an economy. And I think there's probably something to that intuition. An economy that's dominated by rent, probably an economy that's not very functional. Just to give two other examples, by the way, of rent extraction in the modern economy growing to a larger and larger share, I think healthcare systems, especially in America, is increasingly a rent extraction economic model. Anyone who's used prepay and American insurance systems knows this for sure, and especially if you've compared it to the European systems that don't gouge you too much anyway. And the other really hardcore rent extraction mechanism is obviously the university system, which is completely tied up with sending either governments, in the case of Europe, or individual students into debt. I mean, that's obvious rent extraction in a way. It's rent mixed with the usury in a sense. So, yeah, I mean, we don't know because we don't have a good definition. We don't have a good economic definition of rent. It's kind of like that Supreme Court ruling on pornography. We all know it when we see it, but we don't have a very tangible sense of it. But it's an important question. I think if we could define rent a little bit better, it could tell us a lot about the economy. Rent, I really do feel, is an extractive economic process. Not every single type of rent, but when it comes to dominate all economic activity, I think the intuition that most people feel is probably correct, that it's negative for the economy. So I think that kind of feeds into the second question, which I think you're right to see a relationship between the two. And the second question, of course, is, are the productivity gains that we've seen over the past, God knows how long, 30 years, 50 years, I don't know, are they simply due to a bloated service sector? So the answer to this basically is definitionally yes, in a way, because the service sector has grown at the expense of the manufacturing sector everywhere in the world, but at a much, much more rapid pace in the West, which has offshored much of its manufacturing. And service sector GDP, gets booked in the exact same way as manufacturing GDP. And one of the kind of illustrative examples I like to give of this to kind of shock people a little bit is that if you make a whole bunch of forks that are worth £10 and you sell the forks, they're booked as £10. Whereas if you get somebody to come into a casino and spend £10 gambling, that's also booked as £10 in terms of the GDP accounts. Now, intuitively, that feels off to us. We're like, well, a bunch of forks have been made there that stick around and people use, and they're actually something. And in that instance, the guy's just gambled some of his wages away, and somebody's just kind of, the casino always wins ultimately, so you kind of just got robbed in a sense. and we're booking them in the same way. Now, there's all sorts of gray areas in between pure manufacturing and a casino, but those gray areas kind of occupy the service sector. So when I say definitionally it's true, it's because if all of those activities are counted as GDP, well, productivity is just measured by taking GDP and dividing it by the labor force, by the amount of people working. That's how you measure labor productivity. Other measures of productivity effectively come out as the same thing. They're slightly more complicated in the way that they actually physically get the metric, but it's always the same thing. So if you've calculated GDP as including an activity, and that activity is based on the monetary exchange that's taking place, in my example, the guy going into the casino and gambling away £10, that gets booked in the GDP accounts. And so long as that's growing, productivity increases. So, for example, if your casino manages to bring in more people spending £10 on the gambling, but doesn't need to extend its staff at the same rate, or perhaps it brings in more gambling machines rather than staff, then the productivity of that industry will grow. Now, that intuitively is a bit weird because you go, oh, you've put all these people on gambling machines to extract more money out of them. That's not really what we mean when we say productivity intuitively, which is more like making more forks per factory worker. So in a definitional sense, it is true that the expanding service sector, given that it is making up more of GDP, is, in a sense, driving productivity growth in terms of these transactions. And the productivity growth is just more of those transactions per worker in the economy. The only thing I can really say in terms of what that means, kind of a predictive element to it, apart from just explaining it, is that we definitely know, and actually a recent paper that I've done with the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs shows this yet again, but it's been known since the 1960s. If you want to look up Kaldor's growth laws on Google, we've known since the 1960s that there's a very strong correlation between high productivity economies and economies with a very large manufacturing share. So that's the only really predictive thing I could say. If you have larger service sector, your productivity will be less. But that doesn't quite speak to what the question is, which is this all just kind of service sector, bloatedness? Definitionally, yes, it is. But of course, then you come to what it means. So the only thing I could really say shorthand, what it means is, as your service sector grows in an economy, expect lower productivity growth moving forward. And because you have lower productivity growth, unless you get labor force growth up, which is obviously stagnant now because we have below replacement fertility rates, you won't have any economic growth at all. And of course, now I'm just describing the stagnant Western economies. So make of that what you will.
I can't quite answer in such a learned way, but I can talk about how it feels as somebody who, has been around as an adult for a couple of decades now, at least, and how it feels now compared with how it felt in the past. And I would say that
What would Andrew Collingwood say? How does it feel? Why has he been around as an adult for 2 decades? What was that like? Can the future really just be a series of blood-sucking neoliberal squids drawing an IV line from the face of humanity forevermore? We'll have answers to some of these questions, and to many others, on the far side of the velvet rope. For the patrons, the party continues. Check your emails, check your secret RSS feeds. For the rest, well, if you sign up on patreon.com, it's £5, euros or dollars a month. You can cancel any time, and that fee also means you'll have access to our past premium episodes. Give it a go. You stand to lose £5, dollars or euros. As predicted, we did range on for a long time, so in our final 90 minutes, this week's hit list still includes a lengthy book recommendation section, thoughts on Germany's drowning elite, a brief note of optimism, a dense explanation of whether there's such a thing as international QE, plenty of Airbus, and of course, memes. Now, on with the show.